Okay, let's conclude our discussion of social perception today. Just to kind of remind you about what the format of the course is, we're going to proceed one by one through the various topics in social cognition. There are basically three elements here. First, social perception, social memory, and social thinking. The problem of social perception is first trying to figure out how to describe the social stimulus. What's the vocabulary that we use for describing the social stimulus? And second, try to figure out what kinds of perceptual processes allow us to form these internal mental representations of the objects and events in the social world. Okay. Again, if you think about perception in the non-social domain, what the task of perception is to figure out not whether an object is present or not in the environment, that's a problem for sensation, but what the object is, to try to figure out what its form or its shape is, what its location is, and what its activity is. In the social domain, there are analogous tasks, but they go by different names. In the social domain, when we talk about the form of a person, what we mean is kind of what they're like socially, what they're like personally, what their personality traits are, what their emotional states are, what their motives and goals are, and not just what they're doing in terms of a raw description of their behavior, but what the social significance of their behavior is. This is what we're trying to figure out. Okay. In the non-social domain, perception is what we do with a pattern of stimulus energy that radiates from a stimulus and falls on our sensory receptors. And that's what we do in the social domain as well, except that we don't think about it that way typically. Usually, if you look at the whole history of studies of person perception and impression formation that have come down to us since Ash did the first one in the late 1940s, most of the stimulus information in studies of social perception come in the form of linguistic descriptions. It could be something like the classified ads from the New York Review of Books that we started out this set of lectures looking at, or it could be something as straightforward as the 6 or 7 item trait ensembles that Ash used in his classic experiments. But usually we think about the stimulus information for social perception coming in the form of language, coming in the form of words, verbal descriptions of what people are like, and then we're supposed to do something with them, go beyond the information given in the verbal stimulus. But if you think about it for a second, maybe it doesn't take even a second, if you think about it for a second, a lot of the information for social perception doesn't come in the form of words. What a lot of the information for social perception constitutes is physical descriptions, physical stimuli, what things look like, the behaviors that people engage in, how people appear to us. The largely undealt with task in the study of social perception is trying to figure out how we get from the physical social stimulus, the social stimulus as a physical entity that can be described in more or less physical terms, to some impression, internal mental representation of what that person is like as a person, what his traits or motives or emotions or whatever are. So what I want to do today is to give you a couple of examples of lines of research in social cognition that have tried to abandon linguistic descriptions, at least as far as the stimulus elements are concerned, and instead focus on the perception of people that begins with the physical stimulus of their appearance and their behavior. Okay? So again, we usually think about our impressions of people as being encoded linguistically, a verbal description of somebody. What we want to talk about today is how we get to that verbal description. What physical features of the stimulus give rise to the kinds of impressions of the person, or for that matter of the situation, that we encode linguistically. In an early lecture in this series, I contrasted two different views of the perceptual process. First, the constructivist view that comes to us from Helmholtz, that basically says that stimulation is inherently ambiguous and perception poses a problem to be solved by the perceiver, and that what the perceiver does in solving the problem of determining what it is that's out there, where is it going, what's it doing, where is it, and all of that stuff, the perceiver has to draw on inference, make inferences about these things, draw on world knowledge to supplement the vague, fragmentary, and ambiguous information provided by the stimulus. The alternative point of view, which comes to us from J.J. Gibson and his students and colleagues, basically says you don't need any kind of inferential process. You don't need any knowledge drawn from memory or anything else like that for perception. All the information you need for perception is provided by the stimulus itself. There's no need for higher order cognitive, so-called higher order cognitive processes involved in inference, and there's no need for anything like what we were talking about last time, the role of implicit theories of personality in helping us form our judgments of people. This point of view, which began with non-social perception, the perception of depth and motion and other things that are topics for, typical topics for the ecological approach to perception, has more recently been imported into social psychology by a number of investigators, especially the Barron and MacArthur, who have argued vigorously for the application of Gibsonian principles of ecological perception in the social case. Forget about linguistic descriptions. That's our perceptual systems didn't evolve to deal with language, so they say. Our perceptual systems evolved to deal with physical objects in a physical environment. So what Barron and MacArthur and others like them have tried to do is to try to figure out what the physical information is that provides, what the physical stimulus information is that we use for social perception. And they've argued that there's actually quite a bit of physical information in the environment, information that doesn't require any kind of linguistic transmission or anything like that, that gives us a lot of information about what people's emotions are, what their goals are, what their traits are, and so on. First and foremost, facial expressions, okay, which we're going to talk about quite a bit today. Second, bodily orientation and movement and posture. If you're talking to somebody and he leans forward toward you, you get the impression he's actually interested in what you have to say. If you're talking to somebody and he turns his back on you and begins writing on the blackboard or something like that, you begin to think he's really not interested in what you have to say. I haven't said anything, right? It's my physical posture that's giving you this information. Vocal cues, the same way. I love you, honey. The kind of phrases you're going to hear next weekend. Okay, I love you very much. Well, it depends on how you say it, what the words really mean. Interpersonal distance. Sure, cultures vary on this, but that's not important. The important point is that the physical distance from one person to another gives us information about the relationship between those individuals. Whether they make eye contact, whether they touch each other in the course of some kind of social interaction. Physical appearance and mode of dress communicate a lot about what a person is and what the person's like. You go to a hospital and you see a staff member in a long white coat, what do you think? The doctor, okay? Real doctors wear long coats, okay? Interns, the aides and other people like that don't wear long coats. Physicians actively protect their privilege of wearing a long coat because the long coat communicates authority, it communicates status in a hospital situation. The physician doesn't have to say anything at all as long as he or she is wearing a long coat. And then, of course, there's the environment in which the person appears and in which the person's behavior takes place, especially those aspects of the social environment that are under the control of the person that we're trying to perceive. So none of this really involves language as the medium of stimulation, okay? We're unpacking the physical, the social environment and trying to make some kind of sense of it. As I say, where this is worked out a lot, in a lot of detail, is with facial expressions of emotion. And here we owe a lot to Paul Ekman at the University of California, San Francisco, somebody whose work you've probably heard about in other courses, either in psychology or in cognitive science, who spent a lot of time focusing on nonverbal communication between people. Not verbal communication, the exchange of words, but nonverbal communication, the exchange of facial expressions and vocal prosody and posture and all of that kind of business. Now, Ekman himself has done a lot of this work in the context of the detection of deception, and he's argued that nonverbal cues can provide what he calls leakage, what other psychologists also call leakage, the cues that tell you that what the person is telling you verbally might not be true. This is work that is now becoming of some interest to, say, the Department of Homeland Security when they try to identify potential terrorists who might be trying to walk through airport security. And this idea actually has its origins in the work of Charles Darwin, who, after he wrote The Origin of Species and other important documents on evolutionary theory, wrote a little book called The Expression of Emotion in Men and Animals, in which he argued that there were certain emotional expressions that human beings shared in common with other animals, bears, dogs, cats, cows, and so on, and argued that these facial expressions of emotion, especially facial expressions of emotion, were part of our evolutionary heritage, things that we shared with other animals by virtue of the principle of evolutionary continuity. And the idea then that we have these more or less automatic or reflexive ways of expressing our internal emotional states on our faces and other parts of our bodies implies that we have a perceptual apparatus that is built by evolution to extract exactly that kind of information from the social stimulus. We read emotion off other people's faces. Ekman and his colleagues have argued that there are roughly half a dozen of these basic emotions which we humans share with other animals, especially primates, especially mammals, and that we have a pre-wired mechanism both to express these basic emotions in our faces and other bodily gestures, but also that we have a pre-wired set of the pre-wired perceptual apparatus that is geared to reading precisely these faces and telling us what another person's emotional states are. So here are these are posed by an actor in Ekman's employ, but these are kind of prototypical the facial expressions of these various emotions. Okay, so for example, what are the facial cues that tell us that somebody's happy? Well, that's clearly a happy face, okay? And the big facial cue is the smile, the upturned corners of the mouth. There's some debate in the literature about whether you should show your teeth or not. This person is actually showing a lot of teeth, okay? But there's also, when you show teeth, you may also communicate anger, as you'll see in a couple of minutes. But that smile is really a facial cue. And when we see somebody who looks like that, we immediately, without thinking about it, okay, all the information you need for perception is provided by the stimulus. We have an impression of this person as a happy camper. Here we have, yes?
Quick question. Did Ekman by any chance study if perceptual acquired stages related to mirror neurons?
No. I'm going to talk about mirror neurons later in the course, okay? It's a very interesting idea, okay? But it doesn't have, that's a question that's going to go over most people, including me, right now. But mirror neurons were discovered only relatively recently, okay? And if you look at the dates here, I mean, Sylvan Tompkins was doing this in the early 60s. I mean, people barely knew about neurons in the 1960s. But to make a long story short, yes, it's entirely possible that in the course of perceiving somebody else's smile, we activate motor programs that would lead us to smile as well. And that it's that information that creates the percept. That would be a short and completely inadequate version of the mirror neuron story. So it's possible, and you'll see later on how this might be relevant. But right now, let's just look at the stimulus cues that tell us that this person is surprised. First, the widening of the eyes, okay, and the opening of the mouth. That's not a smile. That's more of a, oh, that's interesting. But Darwin argued, and Ekman showed in cross-cultural studies, that people, in terms of cross-race emotion perception, people will, regardless of their cultural heritage, will tend to perceive this person as being surprised, okay, being astonished, something like that. And you don't have to say, well, here's a picture of somebody who's surprised. You just know it. You know it immediately in exactly that Gibson sense. Your perception is not mediated by anything else. Your perceptual apparatus has evolved in such a way that you perceive this person as surprised. Facial cues to sadness, the lowering of the eyebrows, especially the outer corners of the eyebrows. Mouth tends to be closed when you're sad. This one is a little open, okay. There's some individual differences here, but the lower lip is out. So if you just kind of do this for a second, okay, lower your eyelids, okay, close your mouth, and push your upper lip out. You look very sad, okay, you really do, okay. And I didn't have to be taught that, right? Back when I was a dog or a lizard or something like that, evolution put this perceptual apparatus, organized my perceptual apparatus in just this way. Facial cues to fear. Here the eyebrows are raised, not lowered. The eyes are opened wide, kind of like the surprise, but not exactly. The eyes aren't round here the way they are in surprise. The head's back, the chin is tucked in, and the mouth is open, again, but not open in a smile, not open in a grimace either. Again, the idea is this is the physical stimulus that gives us the impression that this person is afraid. Disgust, okay? The eyes narrow, maybe squinting. The upper lip is raised, okay? A little snarl there. Maybe your nostrils are flaring, mostly because there's probably some smell that's elicited this face. But Darwin and Ekman and others, but especially Darwin, makes the point that when dogs smell something foul, they look just like this, right? And the next time you got a dog, okay, and your dog is happy, you'll see him put on a really nice smile. And when your dog is scared, you'll see him put on that scared face. That was Darwin's idea, that not only has evolution built into us an apparatus for expressing our emotions on the face, evolution has also built in a perceptual apparatus that allows us to extract this information from other people's faces and so perceive their internal emotional states. Okay, and then finally anger, okay? The eyebrows are drawn down and together, kind of a scowl. You might raise the upper eyelid a little bit, press your lips together, push your lower lip up, and contract your jaw muscles, and that's the facial expression of anger. So again, the idea here is that there are these cues, nonverbal cues to people's internal states. Ekman himself has developed what he calls a facial action coding scheme that he trains people in for a fee. This is a money-making enterprise here. Basically trains people to read these expressions, even in people who are trying to cover up what their emotional states are. It's a very complicated system, takes some time to learn it, but it's based on the existence of certain muscle action units in the facial musculature, like there's a muscle that raises the inner brow, does that, okay? You can be Groucho Marx. And there's a lip corner puller, one that pulls them up or pulls them down or whatever, a jaw clencher. That's kind of verbal descriptions of what these muscles do. But there's a relatively small set of muscles in the head or the neck that basically accomplish these various kinds of movements. And again, the idea is that this is all basically reflexive in nature. That when you're angry, there's a reflexive response to the anger, puts the anger on the face, and that the perception has a kind of reflexive quality to it as well. So, for example, here are the muscle actions that underlie the physical description of the face. You want to put your eyebrows, draw them down and together. You use 3 different facial muscles for that purpose. You want to raise your upper eyelid. There's another muscle that comes in. You want to press your lips together. You use the orbicularis oris muscle. You want to push your lower lip up. You've got to use your mentalis muscle. Some of you had mothers who told you that it takes 27 muscles to frown, but only a single muscle to smile. It's true, it turns out. There's a lot of muscles. It's a lot of it takes a lot of work to frown. So you might as well save effort and just smile all the time. But again, we don't have to actually go to the skeletal musculature to understand what's going on here. The facial cues are the information for the perception of emotion on the face. It's just that these facial cues are themselves a product of certain kinds of muscle activity. Another example of this is one that Ekman talks about a lot. It turns out that there are 2 different kinds of smile. Okay, there is what's known as the Duchenne smile, named after a French investigator who first described this, which is the kind of smile that people put on when it's a genuine smile. It's an involuntary smile. When they're happy, they just kind of do this, and basically involves only 2 muscles: the zygomaticus major, okay, which produces the smile, and the orbicularis oculi, which raises and opens the eyes a little bit. The other kind of smile is sometimes known as the Pan American smile, because it was the smile. It's essentially the smile that public service workers are taught, like airline cabin attendants and clerks in grocery stores and things like that, where they put that smile on, right? And it's a fake smile, right? You know they'd rather be dead or rather you be dead or something like that. But they got to smile because it's a condition of their job. This polite, voluntary smile, which involves just the zygomaticus muscle, not the eyes, okay, is a way that Ekman has of teaching people who's really happy and who's not really happy. These guys are ostensibly really happy. These guys are just doing their jobs. But again, the whole point here is that you don't have to, are you really happy today? You know, or is that just your job? You can read it off the face. You don't need language. You don't need to think about it. We simply have these automatic reflexes built into us. Okay, so that's the general idea. Now, I'm not going to go on and talk about all of the ramifications of Ekman's work. I just use this as an example of the immediate perception of somebody else's internal emotional state and the general argument that not only has our emotional apparatus evolved in such a way that we automatically express these emotions on our face, the emotions that we feel, our perceptual apparatus has apparently evolved in such a way that we automatically extract this information from the stimulus and read the individual's emotion. There's a very interesting application of this to the Mona Lisa. People have always wondered about this smile. There's even a Nat King Cole song about it. Lots of theories in art history about what makes the Mona Lisa's smile so strange, which a lot of people think it is. Some art historians argue that this is a so-called archaic smile, a kind of smile that you find in ancient Egyptian and Sumerian and Greek statuary superimposed on a more modern woman, painted in the Renaissance, or maybe the smile is an index of her momentary mood, or it's ambiguous in some ways. Well, it turns out the Mona Lisa smile is ambiguous. An investigator by the name of Sebi applied Ekman's facial action coding system to the Mona Lisa and discovered that the Mona Lisa smile was composed of 83% happiness, okay, 9% disgust, 6% fear, and 2% anger, okay? That you kind of, those are the components of the smile. Whether that helps us really understand why Leonardo painted the Mona Lisa this way, probably not, okay? Did Leonardo somehow intuit this? Well, maybe. It's not clear that this is a great contribution to art history, but it's a very nice example of how you can use the Ekman facial action coding system at least to do some kind of analysis of a particular work of art. Okay, so that's basically all about that. Let's move from beautiful faces to the problem of facial beauty. What is it that makes faces attractive? Why are we attracted more to some faces than to others? This problem of physical attractiveness is a really important one for social psychology because it turns out that an individual's physical attractiveness is the most powerful determinant of whether we're going to like that person or not. Okay, we know all about you can't judge a book by its cover, but the fact of the matter is we do, okay? The fact of the matter is that of all the things, they can share your political beliefs, they can share your taste in music, they can do all this other kind of stuff, but if they don't look good, you're not going to like them nearly as much as you will if they do. And it turns out that physical attractiveness influences a whole host of other judgments. This is the origin of the halo effect. If somebody is physically attractive, we tend to believe that they have other socially attractive traits, that they tend to be smart, they tend to be nice, they tend to be friendly, and so on. It's not necessarily the case, but physical attractiveness spills over into other social judgments. That's what the halo effect is. So the question is, what makes a face beautiful? And psychologists and philosophers of aesthetics and other people have spent a tremendous amount of time trying to figure out exactly what it is that makes the face beautiful. They've measured things like the distance of the eyes from the chin and the top of the head, and the average distance of the eyes from each other, and the average spread of the nostrils on the nose, and all this kind of stuff. They got all these feature measurements, and yeah, you can kind of characterize an attractive face in terms of certain the feature measurements. That's how plastic surgeons stay in business. You ever watch Nip Tuck on TV? You know that's exactly what they do. There are these things you have to do for your profession, right? And one of them is to watch Nip Tuck just once. Okay. If you watch it more than once, well, I don't know, but that's. But you should watch it. You should watch it at least once. But so why? Well, why do these particular measurements come about? Well, that is the $6 million question in social cognition. Ellen Burscheid and Elaine Walster, the leading authorities in the entire universe on interpersonal attraction, in the very first edition of their book, said, look, we just have no idea. There's no answer to the question of what constitutes beauty. Well, that was true in 1974. It's not true any longer. We actually have a very good idea what constitutes beauty, at least facial beauty. And it comes from the work of Judith Langlois and her colleagues. She's a New Zealand psychologist. And basically, it turns out, somewhat paradoxically, that average faces are more perceived as more attractive than non-average faces. You might think that that's counterintuitive. Well, that's the whole point of science. If you could intuit the whole thing, you wouldn't become a psych major, right? You just talk to your grandmother and get everything that you need. There are two theories about this. One is an evolutionary theory that basically says that natural selection, Darwinian natural selection, has a kind of normalizing function. The idea here is that extremes in physical appearance, if you're too tall or too short or too fat or too thin or you don't have one of your arms or something like that, these kinds of extremes are markers of genetic mutations, and they argue that mate selection prefers people with average-looking faces because average-looking faces, being very attractive, okay, are markers of robust reproductive health, okay, fecundity and all of that kind of stuff. Then there's just this prototype theory, which we'll talk about a little bit later, which basically argues that we carry around in our heads category prototypes, which are, in some sense, the average of all the examples of the category that we've encountered. And the closer an object looks to, appears to the category prototype, the more likely we are to perceive it as familiar. And we know that familiarity is also a major determinant of preference. So anyway, Langlois and her colleagues performed a number of very interesting studies using the computer averaging of faces. What you do is you've got 100 people in this class. We take 100 full-face headshots, and then using a computer program, we kind of blend various numbers of faces together. And that's exactly what they did, matching the location of the eye pupils and the midline of the lips. They produced composite photographs that were the average of 2 or 4 or 8 or 16 or 32 faces. Now, this is not 32 shots of the same person. This is one shot of 32 different people, all kind of glommed together using this computer averaging algorithm. Here are some examples of their stimulus materials, some men and some women. And what we've got here are composites of 4 faces, 8 faces, 16 faces in this row, and 32 faces in this row. And if you just look at these for a second, okay, what you can see is that, you know, this guy really is more attractive than this guy. And this woman is more attractive than this woman. Now, that's not to say that she's unattractive, okay, or for that matter that he is, but there's a general increase in attractiveness, and it comes out, in fact, in the data. Here we have the average rating of physical attractiveness for male and female targets. These are individual faces, and then composites of 2, 4, 8, 16, or 32 faces. And what you can see is that there's a progressive growth in facial in rated attractiveness of these faces. That 16 and 32 face composites are rated as significantly more attractive than 2 or 4 face composites. So again, it's just a piece of data about this question of what it is that determines the facial attractiveness. So the puzzle of facial attractiveness actually seems to be solved. Okay, in 1974, there was no answer to this question. Just 15 years later, 1990, Langlois and Rogland argue that attractive faces tend to represent the central tendency or the averaged members of the whole category of faces. And again, that's the empirical fact. Okay, if you want to know what determines facial the attractiveness, the answer is average faces are more attractive than non-average faces. But again, the question is why this is the case. And again, evolutionary psychology has this idea that mate selection tends to focus on people who are perceived as high in reproductive health. Males are going around looking for female partners who are going to produce lots and lots of healthy children. And they argue that what actually makes a face attractive is not averageness per se, but symmetry. Okay? Average faces are by definition very symmetrical because all the asymmetries have been averaged out. And they argue that facial symmetry is a marker of health, and that the reason average faces are attractive to us is that the very fact of averaging eliminates what the evolutionary psychologists call fluctuating asymmetries. Again, fluctuating asymmetries, you got more fingers on one hand than the other, you got one arm longer than the other, you've got all these kinds of things. And the evolutionary psychologists say that these fluctuating asymmetries are markers of poor reproductive health. We try to avoid them. Now, there's something to this. If you look at something like the images of the Egyptian queen Nefertiti, Nefertiti in ancient Egyptian actually meant perfectly beautiful woman, and you'll see that she's really quite symmetrical. Okay, now that might be art, but the idea is one of the things that made Nefertiti very beautiful is that she is symmetrical, no fluctuating asymmetries there. But by the same token, if you kind of look at the kinds of faces that people tend to perceive of as highly attractive, it's not clear that fluctuating asymmetry is necessarily a bad thing. Consider, for example, Marilyn Monroe, who in the 50s and early 60s was most American men's prototype of what an attractive woman should look like. And you can see this big fluctuating asymmetry right there. I mean, nobody would want to date somebody with a face that looked like that. That's just bad. Here's Cindy Crawford, has the same problem. This big fluctuating asymmetry there that suggests that her reproductive health is not very good. So you wouldn't want to spend any time with her at all. And you can do the same thing. You can do the same thing with male pictures. I only select these because, of course, Marilyn Monroe and Cindy Crawford actually bring out the beauty mark, right? They emphasize that, right? So there's a real contradiction here between the theories of the evolutionary psychologists and common sense. Okay. I will tell you, I don't have this slide with you, but I will tell you that Langlois and her colleagues made use of data collected here at Berkeley a couple of years ago to actually run a study of the relationship between facial attractiveness and health using longitudinal data that had been collected by the late Professor Jack Block here. And they found zero correlation. Not just a little correlation, zero correlation between rated facial attractiveness and objective indices of health, whether it's reproductive health or something else. So again, score 2 points, I suppose, against the evolutionary psychologists. But the evolutionary psychologists make a particular prediction, that what we find attractive in faces is not their averageness, but their symmetry. Because it's the symmetry of the face, the lack of fluctuating asymmetries on the face that we're really looking for. So what Gillian Rhodes and her colleagues did was a very interesting psychometric study in which she took a bunch of faces using, again, computer-averaged the composites and got independent ratings of the symmetry of the faces, their pleasantness, and their attractiveness, and used both averageness, which is something you can experimentally manipulate, and symmetry, which is something that's rated, to determine what people really rely on when they rate the ratings of attractiveness. The way they did this is using the statistical methodology that some of you may not be familiar with. First, they looked at the raw correlations between averageness and symmetry and attractiveness. And then what they did was they computed something called a partial correlation. It turns out that averageness and symmetry are themselves correlated with each other, okay? Because average faces are by definition symmetrical, but you can take out the correlation between symmetry and attractiveness and find what the correlation is of averageness alone is, okay? That's what the partial correlation does. And what you can see here is these are the correlations with averageness and facial attractiveness. They're very high, okay? But when you take out symmetry, they stay very high. The correlations between symmetry and attractiveness are considerably lower, and when you take out averageness, they go even further down, okay? So the averageness really is the determining factor here, not symmetry. Average faces are perceived as attractive even if they're not symmetrical or even disregarding symmetry, but symmetrical faces aren't perceived as attractive unless they're also average. So again, we actually have, for once in our lives, what looks like a solution to an age-old problem of social perception. What leads us to perceive a face, that most ubiquitous of all social stimuli, what leads us to perceive a face as attractive? First thing is averageness. And second, the relationship between averageness and attractiveness is not an artifact of symmetry. It's not a product of symmetry. The relationship between averageness and attractiveness stays very, very, very high. I mean, gee, you really would kill for correlations like this in social science, even when you factor symmetry out. So, I mean, there you go. Okay? Yes, symmetry is important. Symmetry does make a contribution, but it's not the determining contribution. Averageness is, and the attractiveness of average faces is not an artifact of symmetry. Okay? So, yes? Mm-hmm.
And over time, people selected names for that. The average would represent that template.
Uh-huh.
So it's not that it's average, but it's the template.
Yeah, you could think of that. I suppose you could think of that as circular in some sense, but it's where's the template going? Does the template go to extremes? No. The template comes towards the middle. But even though the template is coming towards the middle over the course of evolutionary time or something like that, still there's wide variation. Remember that natural selection requires natural variation. There are some people who are going to be very distant from that template in one direction, and other people who are going to be very distant from that template in one direction or the other, and we're still not going to perceive those faces as all that attractive. Okay, so I think it's not exactly similar, but what we're looking at here is exactly what the mechanism is. So, I mean, this is actually, I think, a surprising result. We would not ordinarily think of averageness as more attractive than non-averageness. We usually think about things that are really attractive as being distinctive in some ways, but that just turns out not to be the case. It's weird, okay? But then what is it about averageness? Is it averageness, or is it something else like symmetry? It turns out to be averageness. Okay? That's just kind of the way it goes. And again, there might be some exceptions somehow, but again, we tend to like these things that kind of come together towards the middle. As I suppose that's a very Aristotelian principle, right? We like the median, right? But it turns out to be true. It turns out to be true in this case. One more example, I can do this really fast, I think. One more the example from this literature is work by Leslie Zebrowitz. That is the same person as Leslie MacArthur. MacArthur was her old name, Zebrowitz is her new name, on what's known as baby-facedness. And Zebrowitz, who's one of the originators of the Gibsonian ecological perspective on social perception, has argued that baby-facedness is a universal stimulus for caretaking. That if you see an object that has the qualities that we associate with baby-facedness, we want to take care of it. We don't tend to aggress against it. We don't get angry at it. We don't do all sorts of things. And that these, again, in true Gibsonian fashion, just like there are visual cues to surprise or anger or joy or disgust or whatever, there are these visual cues to this universal stimulus of babiness. Enlarged eyes, enlarged lips, soft chubby cheeks, fine eyebrows, a pug nose, a large cranium relative to the rest of the face, and a particular slope, the slope to the forehead. Here is comparisons across species: humans, rabbits, dogs, and birds, immature members of the species, mature members of the species. And you can see that in each case, I mean, that's a baby-faced pigeon, okay? In a way that's not a baby-faced pigeon. That's a baby-faced baby in a way that's not a baby-faced anything. And it works out for lots. The next time you adopt a kitten at the SPCA, the reason people gravitate towards kittens as opposed to adult cats is because they elicit this behavior. You can just kind of see the Gibsonian wheels churning, right? That there are these, you don't need to make any inferences. Oh, I think this would be something I'd like to take care of. You just want to take care of this thing. Okay, here are some stimulus materials used by Zebrowitz, in which these aren't computer morphed. These are drawn, where this face is very much more, the face on the left is very much more baby-faced than the one on the right. Big cranium relative to the face, okay? The eyes lower, eyes and the lips lower on the face, and so on. And what Zebrowitz, yes? Yes, it does exactly work that way. I'm going to show you that, okay? Because what Zebrowitz and her colleagues did was to take faces like this and have people rate these faces in terms of various kinds of psychological characteristics, okay? Here's some more profiles. Baby-faced profile with this cranium, okay? And then over there, something else. Okay, so she showed these people schematic drawings of human faces, manipulated their facial features to make them more or less baby-faced or right in between. Note, and I don't want to read about this in the daily paper, okay? It's just a fact that the typical male face, the typical male face is actually more mature in these terms than the typical female face. And what she did was to make the typical male face more babyish and the typical female faces a little bit more mature. And then she had male and female subjects view these sketches and then rate impressions of personality. These are the sketches, or these are samples of the sketches. Okay. So you got baby-faced, central, and mature. Baby-faced, central, and mature. Okay. And so you get things like ratings of power, okay? And what she found was that baby-faced males are rated lower in power than so-called mature males, and that's true for baby-faced females as well, same kind of effect. Ratings of warmth, okay? Not so much going on with the males, but here the baby-faced females are rated as more interpersonally warm, more friendly. The so-called matured, or rather maturified, I suppose, female faces, rated as less warm. Ratings of masculinity, okay, baby-faced males rated as less masculine, and so on. So again, this is information about the person that is, in one way or another, conveyed by the face. And because of these baby-faced features show a lot of continuity across the species, the idea is that we pick up this information from the stimulus. Now, I'll just say to you, this does work, okay? You get Elmer Fudd, Tweety Bird, things like that, but it doesn't always work, okay? Nobody would, except his family members, I suppose, would characterize Dick Cheney as somebody who's warm and gentle and in need of caretaking, okay? And just to put the icing on the cake, the underpants bomber from Christmas Day 2009 was invariably characterized in the newspapers as baby-faced. Okay, I could get you the sites if you want. So these are not inviolate cues, but the fact that he was characterized as baby-faced speaks to the power of the cue of baby-facedness. People say, gee, he looks harmless enough. He looks innocent, but it turns out maybe he wasn't. Okay? Physical features leading to impressions of personality.